Hello, Murat Bey. Thank you very much. I hope you are safe and well. Thank you very much. So far, I have been able to avoid the COVID. My friends, my family members, we have been well, and I hope this will continue. I would like to thank you for your invitation. We would like to thank you for joining us. Thank you. I think it was 3 years ago, in 2017, the last time I participated in SteelOrbis, but there many things have changed since then. The steel industry have gone through challenging times. 2018, 2019, these were not easy years, and protectionism was on the rise all around the world. The protectionist measures were always in place, but in recent years they have been on the rise. And Veysel Bey and Uğur Bey told us about the outlook on the steel market in Turkey. They talked about our expectations, the current conditions. I would like to introduce a global outlook on the industry. Thank you very much, Baris Bey. Actually, we want to host you every year, but sometimes our schedule conflicts with the meetings of the World Steel. But this year we have been lucky. You have changed the times, and this is an opportunity brought by the pandemic. You are with us. Thank you. The floor is yours. Okay, let me share my presentation. I guess you can see it. Yes, we can see it. Distinguished participants, have a nice day. Have a nice evening. During this difficult pandemic, I wish you patience and health, and I would like to wish well on everyone who are fighting with the disease right now. These are the main titles in my presentation. As you can see on this slide, I will be talking about the short-run impacts of the pandemic on the steel industry. Then I will talk about our expectations in the long run, the long-term expectations, particularly the changes brought by the pandemic in the expectations in the long term in the steel market. And finally, I will be talking about the steelmaking materials markets. I will be talking about the developments and the expectations for the future. Veysel Bey and Uğur Bey have really made very nice presentations about the Turkish steel industry. Particularly the analogy of the Chinese bus driver was important because the China played an important role in the conditions that we are in now. But as Uğur Bey mentioned, everyone on the bus, all major steel manufacturers on the bus have to do more to ensure sustainability. And when we say sustainability, we talk about economic, environmental, and social sustainability. And in this regard, World Steel makes significant studies to contribute to the sustainability of the steel industry in the world. So let me start my presentation. COVID-19's impact on steel output and demand in 2020. How was 2020? I would like to take a step back here. I would like to look at 2019 and the expectations at the end of 2019 and the impact of the pandemic on these expectations. The graph that you see on this slide is the world ex-China's crude steel production, MT, in 2018 and 2019 on monthly basis. Green is 2018 and blue line is the 2019. And you can see that in the second half of 2019, Crude steel production went down as compared to 2018. The gap was growing, and in 2019, the global ex-China steel production was quite weak. But why this happened? There were two main reasons. The first, global manufacturing industry was weakening. The weakness in the manufacturing activity had a global impact, particularly in the sales of automobiles, which had been going on for 2 years. And the second main reason was, as Besabe and Urme mentioned, Turkey and Brazil and other emerging countries had been going through a rough time in economic terms. Particularly in 2019, steel production and demand was quite chaotic in these countries, and these emerging countries in challenge, and also all major steel manufacturers and users were expecting that there will be a mild recovery in 2020. For example, the global manufacturing industry would increase manufacture, the automobile sales will be recovered. These were the expectations. And in the first few months, we saw these expectations coming true until the pandemic came up. On this slide, you see the course of the pandemic for three countries, China, Korea, and Italy. You see the number of the cases from the start of the year until the last days of the year. As we know, the pandemic started in China. By the end of January, it was rising very quickly, but China acted very quickly to take the pandemic under control. And by the end of February, they started going back to normal. As China was taking steps to going back to normal, unfortunately, the rest of the world was fighting with the pandemic. You see in the red area, we have Korea, and in the green area, we have Italy. Unfortunately, by the end of February, the number of cases dramatically increased. But the Korean example was quite different from other countries. Korea, Taiwan, Japan used effective filiation and intense testing processes and very brief lockdown periods to keep the pandemic under control. But as we have seen in Italy, in many other countries had to lock down for a very long time, and they were able to keep the pandemic under control by the end of the May. But after the summer months, the second wave started. The expectation for a second wave came true. So what happened in the Turkish industry? As Veysel Bey and Uğur Bey mentioned, China took the pandemic under control very quickly. You see the China BFs. China took some steps to support the economy. They supported the construction industry and infrastructure investments. And China's manufacture came back to the same levels as last year. It broke many records since May for the last 5-6 years for ballast furnaces. It has been going on with 5% increase. But the situation around the world is quite the opposite as compared to China. For the rest of the world, monthly output of BF in March, it was about 37-38 million tons. In April, it plummeted down to by 30-40%. Then it went up again. Of course, there was a huge shrinking in the demand, and there were operational challenges and disruptions in the supply chain in the last few months. The numbers is about 33, 35 million tons in output of ballast furnaces. And as compared to last year, these are well below the numbers. In 2019, it was a weak year. And this year, the steel industry was expecting some recovery. But with the shock of the pandemic, the year was even worse than 2019. And I think this description would be sufficient to describe the challenge that we have gone through and the expectations. This table on the slide was the short-term steel forecasts by World Steel. European Union had 158 million tons of steel demand in 2019. This is a weak level on the European Union. With the pandemic, it went down to 135 million tons. So there was a loss of 25 million tons. You can see on the right-hand side, this corresponds to 15% decline. In 2021, the expected recovery is about 10-11% growth. This means the total steel demand will be 150 million tons. As compared to 2019, there is a loss of 10 million tons. So in 2021, this loss of demand is expected. This also applies for the rest of the world. North America, South America, emerging countries, Middle East, developed Asia, 10%, 15% loss this year, and 6, 7 or 10% recovery next year. And for the rest of the world, excluding China, the steel demand is 748 million tons for 2020, and for the 2021, the expectation is 815 million tons. So the recovery in 2021 will be about 45 million tons. And in China, the demand will be maintained at the same levels. In Turkey or other regions, which is described as other Europe, it is the only growing region other than China. The Uğur Veysel explained why. So what have we learned in raw material prices this year? On this slide, blue line shows the average cost of BF feedstock. The red line shows the EAF feedstock. The difference between the two is shown by the bars. Very interestingly, in the last 1 or 2 years, the difference between the feedstock between BF and scrap is very low. During the pandemic, this also continued. This was largely because China, as the world was in trouble, China increased its demand for steel and iron and kept the demand alive and led to a rise in the prices. So China's impact is limited here because there is a restriction on imports of scrap. So this is a more competitive picture for scraps. This is one point. The second point is that the scrap prices were quite stable despite this tumultuous year. Maybe in the beginning, the demand for scrap and the supply of scrap was affected because the collection of scrap was disrupted, and Turkey was recovered, which supported demand. and the construction industry was less affected by the pandemic as compared to the other sectors. And these are the factors that supported the scrap. So, to conclude on the short run impact, as you can see, there's a stark contrast between China and the rest of the world. This contrast was even strengthened during the pandemic. China increased its steel demand by 8%, but there was a shrinking by 13% in the rest of the world. Based on our expectations in October, the recovery in 2021 will only be partial. It will not be, it will be even lower than the weak year of 2019. Of course, there can be some more positive expectations, but according to the current picture, depending on the course of the pandemic, not only for 2021, but for the subsequent years, there will be a long-term loss in demand. This should be taken into consideration. And of course, there will be other impacts, long-term impacts of the pandemic. I will be talking about them in the second part of my presentation. Potential impact of COVID-19 pandemic in the long term in the steel industry. How did the pandemic affect our long-term expectations? In this graph, you can see the mega trends that are going to shape the world in the long term. Let's start with the left-hand side, climate change and environmental issues, and also global economic and geopolitical shifts, demographic and social changes, aging population or individualism in social norms, urbanization, and technological progress. Particularly technological progress and climate change have now become transformative powers in the world, particularly in the last decade. And in the future, these factors will be even more stronger in changing the world. And also the pandemic really intensified the pressure of climate change and global economic shifts. For example, in technological progress, remote working, remote learning, online shopping, and use of online services became more popular. And these were changes that were going to happen in 5 or 10 years, but because of the pandemic, they happened in a few months. Maybe when we go back to normal, there will be some threading back, but I think it would be more realistic that some of these changes will be here to stay. And in terms of climate change and environmental problems, the pandemic had an impact. In developed countries, it was very difficult to take the pandemic under control, and the perception of the people, the perception of safety was undermined. Of course, our success in the struggle against pandemic was very limited. And when we are faced with the destructive impact of global climate change, what are we going to do? The humanity is faced with this question now. So the pressure in terms of environmental issues, the demand for recovery, the demand for taking the environmental issues under control will be on the rise in several countries. And with the increase of this pressure, there will be a more accelerated green transformation. The pandemic also accelerated some economic and geopolitical changes that we were already going through. In previous presentations, we talked about the weakening in globalization, increased protectionist measures, etc. In the initial period of pandemic, there was a problem in the supply of medical equipment, and there were problems in the coordination of healthcare professionals in the healthcare system. I think this may also contribute to the course of the pandemic in the future. So in the future, the pandemic may lead to the weakening of globalization, and it may also lead to an increase in the protectionist measures. So, what is the impact of this on our long-term expectations for the steel business? We can discuss this under three categories: how we make, the manufacturing processes. Our expectation is to minimize our footprint on the environment, actually accelerating our efforts to reduce our footprint. But if we are going to accelerate our efforts, we need to expect that it will have more impact on our business. Use of scrap materials, investments on energy efficiency, new low carbon emission steel manufacturing equipment investments. I think these are becoming more solid, concrete in the future. And secondly, what we make, our product portfolio. In steel industry, the product portfolio is developed in accordance with the demand. But we see that with the pandemic, the steel users, automobile and construction industries, the change in the demands of these industries may be accelerated because of the pandemic. Green technologies, green mobility, green infrastructure, green buildings, green vehicles, smart vehicles. The steel solutions needed for these projects should be supplied on time. And to do that, the steel industry should take more quick actions to respond to these demands. And finally, how we position our industry and products and how we communicate our position to the other industries, to the public industry. Here, I have the same keywords, green and smart industries. The steel playing a key role in these transformations. This was the position that we adopted for our industry, but we should be doing this more actively. We should use these arguments more actively. We should use our numbers in a more advanced way. We should step up our gear. We should gear up, and as Urbe mentioned, we should ensure economic, social, and corporate sustainability. And to do that, we should accelerate our actions when we consider the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's go to the steelmaking materials market. Let's start with the iron ore. Iron ore, global seaborne iron ore supply to grow by about 130 million tons over 2019. We expect an increase in the supply by 130 million tons. Actually, we expect a growth in the supply by 85 million tons by 2024. Of course, the substitution or capacity increasing activities in Australia. In Brazil, the capacity increasing in Vale, San Marco coming back partially. In North America, in South America, some new projects will become operational by 2024, and this is why the supply will increase. And issues in iron ore supply. and the factors that may lead to problems in the steel industry. The first one is in Brazil, Vale coming back, increasing capacity, San Marcos increasing capacity. There may be a risk of delay in return of operations. Secondly, in the recent months, the pandemic was like out of control in Brazil. But in the future, we should also see this as a risk factor. In Australian, Australia is more successful in delivering of operations on time, but last year the quality was behind the expectations. This was interesting. We should take that into consideration. And secondly, as the sustainability standards increase, this also may delay the delivery and commissioning of projects. For example, in Australia, there was a project by Furioton, and a cave used by the Aboriginal community was damaged and it led to some problems. And China, it is a major manufacturer of iron and steel. They use their own manufacturing to meet their demand. But what will happen in the future? This is an important question. New supply areas. China is interested in developing projects in Africa. This may also increase the supply. We should be closely following the developments in this area. And finally, sustainability, the environmental impact. These are important issues for all suppliers of raw materials. For example, in iron ore, there's an interesting calculation. If you process the iron ore on the site of the mine to reduce the carbon emissions, if we agree to do so, who will be bearing the cost to do that? Maybe we should be doing these calculations for each type of raw material. When we look at met coal supply, our expectation is limited increase. Unfortunately, this is worrisome because when we look at the number, after 2019, we see the increase will be only by 10 or 50 million tons. And most of it comes from Australia. In the second slide, I talked about this. India is expected to increase its demand. China is expected to commission new modern facilities on the seaside. And so there will be a significant demand in met coal, but the supply is being restricted. This is concerning for us. So why does this happen? There are some concerns for the mining companies because financially there is less support for coal investments, and coal market is very volatile. Protectionism is increasing. Some countries are in disagreement, in conflict in terms of protectionism, and this causes some problems in the implementation of these projects. And in scrap, there was the big question of China, whether they will relieve the restrictions on import bans. China has imposed very important bans on scrap imports, and in the past, it was importing large amounts of scrap, but today these numbers become very minimal. So Better quality of scrap is taking some actions to exempt ferrous scrap from the ban on solid waste imports effective next year, renaming it as a recycled steel material.
Of course, most probably its impact will be quite low. So, what are the long-term expectations for the obsolete scrap? We are expecting a huge increase in terms of the obsolete scrap. These were the estimations before the pandemic, of course, and the pandemic might have a huge impact have on this obsolete scrap. So in 2019, we have seen that the obsolete scrap was, below 400 million tons, and we are expecting it to go over the level of 600 million tons, and by 2050, we are expecting it to be beyond 900 million tons. So, I mean, in one of our most important inputs, we are expecting a 500 million tons of an increase. Of course, it will have huge impacts and repercussions on the global steel sector. And of course, this increase basically will take place in China. If we take a closer look to the obsolete scrap availability, it was 60 million tons in 2018, and by 2025, we are expecting it to go to the levels of 125 million tons and 280 million tons by 2050. This means that China will have the potential to produce from scrap. But if this is not the case, after a certain time, China will have the potential to become a scrap exporter. Of course, there was huge uncertainty due to the pandemic. Although it is not easy to speak in a crystal clear fashion, it is certain that the pandemic will bring along many structural changes, and pandemic has a potential for inflection points. And what about its impact on our sector? It might lead to loss of employment and income, and of course it will have repercussions in terms of the scrap supply. And if everybody works from their houses, then it might lead to reduced office, schooling, and hospitality activity. I mean, if this is the case, and considering the fact that we are in need of green spaces, then all bunches of question marks will arise, and most probably many of the buildings will be demolished. So it will have an impact on the demolishment activity. Of course, in the long run, it will have huge impact on the scrap availability. So if we have to wrap it up, well, first of all, there will be certain standards that we have to be fulfilling, and we see that those regulations are becoming even tighter and tighter. That's why we have to increase and gear up, boost the gears in terms of our sustainability activities. And I'm not saying all those sentences only for my operation, but on the supply chain side, we should really be careful, and we should provide certain level of transparency in all parts of my supply chain activities. This is a very important development. A second topic which concerns us is the very limited growth of the met coal, and we are expecting that the obsolete scrap availability should continue to grow. Of course, the pandemic brought new uncertainties, and last but not least, increasing scrap availability and environmental pressures hopefully will support the electric arc furnace growth, and it will most probably increase the demand for metallics, and the scrap will be widely used. These are our expectations and projections for the future. All right, this is the end of my presentation. Once again, I'd like to thank all of our audience. Thank you so much, Mr. Ciftci. It was a wonderful presentation. We have learned a lot. Thank you so much. Of course, there are lots of questions, so with your permission, let me redirect those questions to you. So we would like to hold you for a little while more. Let me start with an anonymous question. There is a question about a flat product, a flat plates. For that question, I would like to remind that the flat products will be discussed on Thursday. So we would like to invite you to our session on Thursday. Let me continue with raw materials. There is a question from Gülçin Şimşek. You have spoken about the Chinese investment. Let me read the question. So could you please share your information about the investment on the electric arc furnaces by the Chinese government? And do you think that those activities are, speeding up? I also would like to make a comment. It will allow certain quality products to be imported. So you can take on that. You can elaborate on that question. We will be more than happy if you do so. First of all, since the Chinese steel production is slightly changing, most probably the electric arc furnaces will gain importance. This supply side reforms have been carried out by China, so this turning point have been passed through already. The electric arc furnace share increased from 7 and 8% to 11 and 12% even. Of course, when we compare it with many other countries, those figures are still low. That's why we are expecting that growth to continue. Of course, there are ongoing studies and activities, but at the moment, we are not expecting this transformation to take place so fast. Of course, this growth will continue, but it will not be revolutionary. We are not expecting the share of electric arc furnaces rate to go to the level of 50%. But all the same, the electric arc furnace production by 110 million will be is actually right now taking place. So gradually those ratios will be increasing as well. You have asked a question about the scrap import limitations. So I believe that it has something to do with the increasing capacity of electric arc furnaces. Exactly. I mean, if there are no limitations in the scrap imports, most probably China was going to import a lot of scrap. Of course, those were going to be used by the EAF, electric arc furnaces. And most probably after those limitations are lifted, it will not have huge impact or huge change when we take into consideration the international scrap supplies. And let me continue with an anonymous question with your permission. So the scrap prices are 20% higher when you compare 2020 and 2019, let me correct. I mean, Turkey was hitting the bottom at the end of 2019, but Turkey recovered even despite the pandemic. It has a huge impact in terms of the scrap collection. I mean, the pandemic has such kind of an impact. And the construction sector isn't so much affected by the pandemic because at the end of the day, the construction sector and the activities in the construction sector is taking place in open air. And there are many places where the electric arc furnaces are being produced. It of course has a positive effect. And the iron ore, I mean, the iron prices are increasing, and as a result, it supports these scrap prices. So, very briefly, I also would like to make an additional comment, although we couldn't discuss the last term. Mr. Uğur actually mentioned to that topic in his speech. So, those postponed demand might lead to a boost in terms of the demands after we go back to normal. Why not? It might be, but I also believe that we are in need of infrastructure investments because, I mean, in many countries that we see that the infrastructures are quite old-fashioned, so we are in need of green solutions, and that's why we are in need of new infrastructures. That's why I do believe that on a global scale, we are in need of infrastructure investments. Of course, if we see such kind of infrastructure investments in the short term, then most probably the raw material prices will be well supported, especially scrap. There is an anonymous question again. You have spoken about the ore prices. We are, I mean, one of our participants stated that there has been a 40% of increase in the ore prices. So how can you explain this? Do you think that pandemic has an impact on that? Well, yes, that is the case, but you know, after an accident in Valle Brumigno and San Marcos decommissioned, and also China actually increased its demand to the record levels even during the pandemic, and I mean, the China increased its demand in the iron ore. I mean, as the supply is contracting so much, the demand was increasing at the same time. It has, of course, a huge impact on the prices. Well, the environmental standards will be much more tighter, so as a result, the costs will be increasing. But who is going to pay for those additional costs? So the environmental factor will be seen as an important cost factor. Maybe this was not the case so far, but we will be seeing that environment is an important important factor, which will have an impact on the actually the productions. Maybe some of the sintered material will be used as as pellets in the long term. It will have a huge impact on the beneficiation as a cost. So most probably, the steel producers will be willing to reflect those changes in terms of the costs. So the environmental factor will have a huge impact on the whole global scale of steel industry in terms of increasing costs. There is a question from India. Sushim Banerjee asked a question. SRO estimates were done in September in 2020 for release in October. After 2 months, all countries are talking of increased production, and prices have also risen, as you know. Do you not think that global steel consumption would rise more as compared to October estimates of SRO? Well, this is a wonderful question. Well, I can say and share my personal opinion, but if you have to speak about what is going on the background, the Economic Committee of the Steel Producers Association have gathered 5 times, as you know, and they renewed their forecasts and projections for 5 times. And there is a whole scientific study behind it. As you can guess, these are the expectations as of October. We are going through such extraordinary times. I mean, even within months, even within weeks, the forecasts can change. But let me answer to that question as follows to Mr. Banerjee. There are still lots of uncertainties in the market. We are asking a question whether the third wave will take place or not, what will happen with the vaccine. So, I mean, we are speaking about, I mean, huge supply of cash in the market, but the debts of the companies are rising as well. So we can speak about probable scenarios. I mean, there are more reasons for being an optimist, but there are still many factors which concerns us because there are lots of uncertainties. That's what is my opinion. Thank you. There are lots of questions about the product quality, but I will not be asking those questions to you because this is not your topic. So apologies to our audience. There is another question about the scrap market. So can you say that the scrap prices will be reducing, will be decreasing, and since the investment costs will be decreasing as well, can we expect that the production will be taking place out of the scraps? What do you think about it? Well, we will see what will happen with the scraps because at the end of the day, we are speaking, I mean, about 2030s and 2050s. I mean, projections going all the way to 2030s and 2050s. It's a speculation, but if you take into consideration what is expecting us, electrification, we are expecting electrification to increase. Even in our integrated facilities, there are ongoing studies to utilize scrap more, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the supply will be increasing only. The scraps will be used for further production. But we can also add that this availability is increasing in many developing countries, by the way. Maybe those countries will not be successful in terms of collecting it and making out of those scraps. But also, we have to ask this question: what will be the quality of those scraps? I mean, electrification is not an issue for the steel sector. It is an issue for all the sectors. For example, we are speaking about electric cars. It means that more electric cables will be used. So as we, I mean, recycle the electric cars, what will happen to those scraps coming out of those electric cars? Maybe it will be much more costly to recycle them. So rather than focusing on the scrap supply, I do believe that there will be certain infrastructural changes in the steel sector in order to enable the sector to make use of those scraps. I'll have another question about China. If they start importing scraps, when we take a look to the first specifications which are being published, I see that HMS 12 mix will not be in their agenda. I mean, if they start importing, there are certain, speculations about what the China will target in terms of their imports. What do you think about this issue? Well, we didn't make a comprehensive and detailed analysis about it. Well, I actually shared almost all my analysis with the participants, and most probably, I mean, when the limitations are uplifted, they will, set forth for the high quality products, but it is a niche market anyway. Of course, it will have an impact, but I do believe that this impact will be quite limited. We have Chinese customers as well who follows our services, and when our friends talk with them, certain Chinese companies think that these scrap imports can go all the way up to 50 or 60 millions. I'm not saying this in order to create panic because they think that this will take place in the mid or long term. But what would you like to say about such kind of a speculative comment? Well, China has such an efficient way of management. They can do the changes in such a huge scale in such a short time frame. If they want, it will be. I mean, I'm not sure whether China would like to do that or not. This is another question, and I don't think so. I mean, there are certain criticisms about China and its capacity, but they have done huge changes. Let me be honest. I mean, it's not easy to do such scale of changes in such a short time frame. Many other countries couldn't do it. One last question, then we have taken a lot of your time and we tired you a lot. No worries. In our talks with the producers, we have seen that many steel producers are targeting for a more sound and strong supply chain, and they are trying to diversify their portfolios in terms of the product. That's at least what we see. What kind of an impact it will have on the ore demand? Would you like to make a comment on that? Well, Mr. Murat, this is not the case only for the steel sector. There might be such kind of an endeavor in all sectors. I mean, this global supply chain has its advantages. I mean, your economy will be off scale, it will be a huge scale, it will have, of course, certain advantages in terms of the costs, and globally, everybody will be winning, but there are certain risks behind it. Well, economic off scale is nice, but your supply will be limited to certain centers. I mean, whenever there is a pandemic or whenever there are environmental disasters, floods going on, of course, it will bring along many risks. And that's in that place, you have to think about your stock management. I mean, I increased my stock, but when I increase my stock, what will happen to my, cost advantages? I mean, when you work with more suppliers, it has additional costs, additional requirements, of course. So In a nutshell, what I can say is that maybe although it will be marginal, there will be certain changes in the supply chains in the global scale, because most probably the supply chains are in a quite good position, costly speaking. It's not easy to create an alternative to that, but when the environmental costs are taken into consideration much more seriously, then the picture will be changing, because we have spoken about certain regulations and how those regulations are putting a lot of pressure. I mean, at the end of the day, as a producer, you have to take that into consideration. I am bound by the regulation, but my supplier is not, bound by that regulation. But due to the transparency requirements, I have to show it, and then what will be its impact on me. As a result, most probably many producers will be focusing on importing their or supplying their raw materials from similar regions, from their neighborhood or domestically. Although it will be marginal, I am expecting a slight change in the market dynamics. But in terms of the iron ore, we have to take into consideration certain alternatives. I mean, Australia and Brazil. I mean, Australia and Brazil is competing with each other. In that mind, we don't have many alternatives. Yes, in terms of the iron ore, the situation is not very bright. Last question. Almost all of our participants asked anonymously, what about your forecasts in terms of the iron ore prices? But let me rephrase the question. You wouldn't want to, articulate a certain price, but what would you like to say about the supply and demand scenario for 2021? Well, I abstain from articulating a price because I am far away from the markets. I mean, I'm not like you, so it will not be right to articulate a certain price. But in terms of the supply and demand, I don't think that it will be right to make a comment. We have shared our supply forecasts. There are certain concerns. That is what I try to share with you. I mean, if those concerning points increase, it will have an impact on the costs and prices. In terms of the iron ore, there is that understanding that the supply is increasing. So we are not that much concerned with regards to iron ore supply, but on the demand side, we are not sure. We will see what China will do and what kind of a recovery we will see on the European markets, in Japan, in Korea. They are, seaborne supply dependent countries. And what will the developing countries will do? For example, we have spoken about the Vietnamese example. Well, it will require a huge, comprehensive, and detailed calculation, so we can only speak and speculate about certain risks, and that's what I try to do in my presentation. And I really would like to stop by saying that. Thank you so much. With regards to the expectations in the Asian markets, Yovi Jean will make a presentation. I'm sure you know him very well, and we will ask him about what is going on the Vietnamese market. Vietnam is increasing its capacity. I do believe either they do make a mistake with their calculations, or most probably certain, I mean, like induction furnace type of issues are taken into calculations. I mean, all of a sudden, I don't think that there are still factories which are being commissioned. Most probably, there are certain, other issues behind the curtains. Well, thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for the time that you have allocated for us and for our questions. It was very valuable. We always would like to see you with us. Hopefully, in the upcoming conferences, you will have free time for us. Thank you so much again and again. I wish you a healthy day, and I wish all of our participants a beneficial and successful conference. Thank you so much.